One of the things that I think, when you're starting to read philosophy, it's like anything else. You come across not only words that are unfamiliar, but concepts that are unfamiliar, or words that you might know, but are not really sure about how they're being used in this particular context. So I think that one of the things that a philosophy course should do is to make you more familiar with a certain philosophical vocabulary. And as an example, there's a kind of I think, an important passage in this chapter on page 45, where Blackburn says, "It is good then to remember four options in epistemology, the theory of knowledge." Thank you, Blackburn. You just defined epistemology, which is good. But here are the options. There is rational foundationalism, as attempted by Descartes. There is natural foundationalism, as attempted in Hume. There is coherentism, and brooding over all of them, there is skepticism, the view that there is no knowledge. Might be a good place to start. I mean, as far as vocabulary, well, yeah, Blackburn knows that he's writing a book for beginners, really, in philosophy. So he defines things where he can. But there's a few words there that might not click with you, and one of the functions of a teacher is presumably they have more uh, experience in a certain field, and you can ask them questions. What is he getting at here? How is this word being used? Let's look at that. Now, he says there's four options in epistemology. There's four views of what knowledge is, or whether knowledge is possible, or how it is that we can distinguish between true and false beliefs. Because after all, we want to know whether we know, and we want to know that if we can know, when we do know, which are maybe two different topics or two different issues, but I think that kind of makes sense. Why would we call Descartes a rational foundationalist? Well, first let's look at that word foundationalist or foundationalism. Descartes' whole project in the Meditations is to put his knowledge on a solid foundation. He uses architectural metaphors that his knowledge can be compared to, or analogy can be compared to a building or house, and that the particular things that he knows are like the upper stories, but they have to be based on something, and finally have to be based on the foundation of the house, and that foundation of the house is presumably the I think I am, that cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, I am thinking therefore I exist. That's the rock solid foundation, at least what he proposes for a rock solid foundation, and the idea is that everything else should be built upon that foundation, and if our thinking is methodical and careful and honest, we should be able to see what we can actually build on that, and we can be sure of that too. That is foundationalism, the idea that our knowledge can be based upon some principle, some first thing. And that would be the foundation. Descartes attempts to do that, and there's a very interesting criticism that Blackburn quotes from David Hume, who came along about a century after Descartes, in which he says Descartes couldn't possibly succeed here. That once you raise the specter of skepticism, the sort of global or total skepticism, where you're doubting everything, or trying to doubt everything at least, there's no way you can build things up again, because there's no way that you can, in order to build that foundation, you would have to use things, let's say certain powers or certain things that you think you know. You would have to use things that you've thrown into doubt in order to overcome that doubt, and you'll just sort of be stuck in the skepticism, which is another option, Blackburn says, epistemological option. Skepticism would be the philosophical skepticism would be the thesis that either knowledge is impossible, but that would run into certain difficulties. How do you know that knowledge is impossible? Or that we have not yet established that we know anything. I think that's a more coherent view of skepticism. It's that we don't know anything, or we don't know that we know anything. We might know something, but we don't know that we know anything, and that we're open, skeptics are open to the idea that knowledge can actually happen, but they're not convinced that it has yet. So rational foundationalism would be the idea that through thinking, through rationality, through pure thinking, and that's what oftentimes in this chapter the words reason and rationalism are being used as, is that the idea that just by thinking the thing through logically, through the powers of abstract thought, that I can put my knowledge on a solid foundation. So you could say that rational foundationalism is kind of the opposite of skepticism. Then there is natural foundationalism, which is something that he characterized as Hume's philosophy, natural, rather than trying to put the way that he's using the word natural, I think, is a little problematic there. But the idea is that we have natural ways of distinguishing between true and false beliefs, between knowledge and illusion. We don't have an absolute way, the way that Descartes wanted to put everything on a single foundation. We don't have that. But what we do have are just sort of intuitive, perhaps, or practical ways of distinguishing between true and false. I mean, we see something in the street, walking down a city street, we see something in the street, and we're shocked for a moment because it looks like a dog in front of a car, and then we look closer and we realize it's just a paper bag. It's happened to me about 1 million times walking down the street. That is, we have a way of, when I see that, I have a natural, intuitive way of correcting myself. That is, at first it looks like a dog about to be hit by a car. Then I realize it's simply a paper bag blowing down the street. Now, is that an absolute? Do I have an absolute foundation for my claim that it's really a bag and not a dog? Well, in a way, of course, no. In a way, of course, that would be silly, because when I look again, I can see that it's not a dog. Now, is there some possibility that if I looked a third time, I would realize it was a dog? Absolutely, that's happened too. A little more rarely. Which is to say that if you're a natural foundationalist, I think, like Hume, that you have given up the prospect of ever being totally sure of anything. However, you believe that there are certain, maybe second best ways of distinguishing between true and false. And this is just part of the apparatus of being a person who has common sense and has experience of the world, has a way of getting around the world. So rational foundationalism, the idea that all of knowledge can be put on a solid foundation, and that the rational part is that I arrive at that foundation through abstract thought, through thinking, through arriving at a principle like the I think, therefore I am. Natural foundationalism, as in Hume, the idea that, well, we don't have an absolute foundation for knowledge, but we certainly have ways of correcting ourselves and distinguishing in ways that are satisfactory in most cases between the true and the false. We have ways of gaining what we would call knowledge. There is coherentism. Now, the coherentism is the idea that our beliefs hang together, that there's no absolute foundation, but they cohere, they harmonize with each other. Rather than trying to prove that they are absolutely true, coherentism is the idea that we have beliefs about the world, and what's important is that they all sort of make sense together, rather than trying to establish that they somehow all correctly represent the world. That's kind of thrown in there. It's not really developed very much, but it's an interesting idea. And then finally, skepticism, which is a live option about knowledge. I mean, the idea that we don't know anything, or at least we don't know that we know anything, and we don't have a way of even knowing that we know anything, or that we don't know anything. This chapter on knowledge sort of uses Descartes as simply an example of one person, one philosopher who looked into the so-called problem of knowledge, or did an epistemological work on what knowledge is and whether it's possible, and he had certain ideas and came to certain conclusions about knowledge, which are quite open to criticisms from Hume and other philosophers, from Blackburn himself, from us, but that he had his conclusions, You know, they may be wrong, they may be partly right, partly wrong. So next chapter we'll move on to the subject of mind, which is raised by Descartes, as Blackburn says. Somewhat different problem, not so much an epistemological problem, but maybe another sort of problem.